Today we're going to talk about The Art of War. Essentially, this is a strategy book that was written 2,500 years ago by a Chinese military commander. He essentially stipulates a more in-depth approach to war rather than just one-on-one confrontation. And he stipulates the importance of things like leadership, having strong values, and sticking to your word. We're going to essentially try and relate that to a more modern context, talking about business, talking about relationships, and negotiation.
Yeah, I guess The Art of War is a pretty interesting book in the aspect that it's simple, but also it's kind of effective. I guess the best lessons through life or books are through those simple things. But I guess today, can we kind of detail how, I guess, his philosophies as a commander or a strategist, how do they actually expend themselves into modern day life?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the book is about warfare and how to win in the most efficient approach on the battlefield, but it can definitely be related to business, like strategy, communication, negotiation, which are all key fundamental skills to have in modern day life, especially if you're looking to do something like expand a business or something like that. So I think detailing his philosophy and then expanding on how you can move from just talking about warfare to actually talking about business would probably be beneficial today.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you talk about warfare there, but everything is warfare, even in today's world. Like whether you're trying to start a business, you're trying to get in the gym, whatever it is you're doing, you're competing with other people constantly, right? You're not going out there and, using brute force and causing harm. But, we talked about Rockefeller a few episodes ago, and his whole notion is that business is modern day warfare. So I think a lot of the notions of Sun Tzu actually do translate into modern day life, whether that's in business or negotiations or even relationships. I guess we can detail a bit of that today.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that he's not someone that took war lightly. He knew that it had dire consequences. He knew that ultimately if a battle did happen, people would die, essentially, his side and the other side. So it was like something where he didn't just want to build a massive army and go to war heaps and fight a lot of battles. He actually wanted to almost win without even having to fight in the first place, which is, I think, something very interesting from the book, to be honest.
Well, is that kind of his overarching notion, that whole idea of winning without expending, lots of soldiers or people?
Yeah, I think it would be. And I think ultimately understanding the consequences of your actions in some extent, like, he didn't just laissez-faire send his men into battle. He knew the outcomes of that. And every time, there was a fight, he knew there would be, dire consequences to some extent. And that's the same in business. That's the same in everything. Like, if you take on a competing business rival or something like that, and you take them on head on, there is a chance that your business gets wiped out. Right. And that is a dire consequence because you've obviously got staff, you've got people that rely on your business for a paycheck, say, like that'll have tangible outcomes for their life. So it's like, there's definitely a relationship there to some extent.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a good correlation. I think his whole notion is every action you do, you expend something. In his case back then, you're expending humans, right? You're expending soldiers. I guess in today's world, you're expending money. If you're trying to do a hostile takeover or attack a business, you're expending not people's livelihoods, but you are expending money and perhaps their livelihoods if you do go out of business. And I guess what's striking with him, when you think of great strategists or military commanders in history, your first thought is someone who's gone out there and slaughtering everyone. Like you look at Genghis Khan, he just went out there with brute force and took everything. Whereas Sun Tzu's approach is actually the complete opposite. His whole thing is how can we win through diplomacy without fighting at all? And if we do have to fight, can we make it as swift and as quick as possible? I think that's an important point to note.
I mean, on the topic of diplomacy, like, not even necessarily from the book, like what would a diplomatic approach even look like to some extent?
Well, I guess if you're trying to convince someone in your way of thinking or you're sitting down in a negotiation, it's much easier to get a desired outcome for both people if you're not arguing or trying to attack your opponent or the other business owner with brute force.
Yeah.
If you can sit down and actually see things through their perspective and be diplomatic, it's much more likely you're both going to walk out of that room winners as opposed to just sitting down with someone and arguing and attacking them. Right? Like if I'm trying to convince you to my way of thinking, it's going to be much more easier if I sit down with you and be diplomatic, or if I even showcase what I want out of you through my life. How much easier is it going to be for you to respond positively? If I just sit down with you and scream and shout, this is what I want, this is what you should be doing. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think it's very clear that when you become argumentative and you become offensive to people, you automatically get their defensive walls up. And at that point, they go into defensive mode, which is like a state where they're trying to survive in some extent. And at that point, they're not thinking critically. They're not thinking about how we can make this work together. They're just thinking, how can I defend myself from this person to some extent? And at that point, you've sort of lost them, to be honest. Like, negotiation is definitely an art form. And I suppose that's what we're stipulating here about winning through not first-hand battle to some extent.
Right. Yeah, winning indirectly.
Yeah.
And I think that is his overarching philosophy in the book, is how can you win indirectly through that peace.
Yeah.
Right? And what I guess we're saying is that does apply broadly to life. You know, when you get argumentative with someone, you almost repel them away, right?
Yeah. The interesting thing on that point, and I think it spans off well, is that he stipulates you don't fight the other army, you fight their strategy. And that means knowing, I suppose, who the commander is. What does his prior battles look like? What is it he typically does in a war context or in a business context? It could be the CEO of a company or something like that, a rival. What does his strategy look like? And I suppose, how can you attack the strategy rather than the business itself or the army itself? Does that make sense? Like,
well, he says in the book, know yourself, know the enemy. And that, I think that applies more broadly to business and life. If you know yourself and you know who you're coming up against, you're actually competing like on a chessboard. You're not competing through money or army or people. You're trying to beat his strategy.
Yeah, if his strategy is to buy up, say the Rockefeller example, he had a competitor that was buying up land in his area of where he had a bunch of oil companies. He had a competitor that was buying land in that area. And what Rockefeller did was essentially he started buying land around him and essentially cornered him in, where essentially he had no way of getting supplies in and out. And that was an example of him indirectly just out-competing him to some extent. And I think that is quite strategic. And I think definitely an example of something that would probably be more indirect than direct in nature.
Yeah, sure. I guess, how do some of these things apply more broadly to life, but not business? Like this aspect of diplomacy to me, it's an attitude you take. It's not just if it comes to physical warfare or business, it's an attitude you take in everything you do in life.
So are you saying, how does it work outside of business?
Well, how does it work? Yeah, just broadly.
Well, diplomacy I think, indicates or is needed a high level of emotional intelligence to some extent. To be diplomatic is to understand what context you're in and behave accordingly to some extent. You're not a bull in a china shop just running around all aggressive and stuff like that. You actually understand who's sitting across from you, and your behavior has to reflect who they are to some extent. Like, you are the bigger person when you're diplomatic to some extent. And I think that takes quite a lot of emotional intelligence.
Sure. Yeah, I think diplomatic is actually seeing through other people's eyes. I think if you have that attitude and that approach, you're going to get the best out of your relationships and the people around you. And again, it's maybe in that business sense, if you've got employees, if you're actually seeing things through their perspective, how much more likely are they to stay with you, or how much more likely are you to inspire these people?
Don't you think, in a world where it's so easy to be internally focused and focused on self, how powerful it is when you find someone that's actually externally focused and actually sees who you are for who you are. And it's like, I don't know about you, but whenever you talk to someone that actually has put in the effort to see things from your perspective, you're completely motivated by that person and you want to continue having a relationship with them, compared to someone that's just completely internally motivated and internally focused. You just come away from the situation feeling more isolated and less heard than you did before. Like, there's definitely something powerful there.
That's exactly right. You're inspired by him, like, to put it simply.
Yeah.
And I guess we're stretching a lot of these ideas, right? Because these, he existed at 500 BC, but they do apply. And I think what's more important with Sun Tzu is to take his philosophies and apply them to your life, not necessarily to go out there and, physically, cause altercations or anything like that.
Yeah. I mean, we're sort of talking about leadership here to some extent.
Yeah.
And I think because we're interested in business and stuff like that, we're probably automatically also interested in things like leadership and vision and how to inspire people, because obviously a business is nothing without the people that work inside of it. So in order to actually be successful in that area, you have to know how to motivate people. And something that's interesting in this book is he talks a lot about that sort of, I suppose, being more passive around certain things and not just being, super outright. But he also talks about once you lay down a law and someone breaks that law, you actually have to handle the situation very firmly. It's not something where there's just grey lines and, oh, he's crossed it, I'm just going to forgive it and move on. You actually have to take action to discipline people to some extent. And the reason he does that is because if you're the leader of a business or an army or something like that, and you have insubordination from, one of your men, essentially, if you don't act on that, it tells the other men that it's actually okay for them to be insubordinate as well. And that's actually really bad for, the efficiency of the organization. It actually breeds more lack of discipline in some extent.
It breeds insubordinates. Does that kind of get back to what I said before? Like his first point of reference is how can we win without fighting? But if indeed we do have to fight, his whole idea is let's do it as quickly and as swiftly as possible, and let's slaughter the opponent really quickly. And that's kind of the same notion here. Like he's laying the law with his commanders, but if people are not being disciplined or being insubordinate, they got to go. And that's the same thing in a workplace, or even with your friendships. Like,
it's interesting because you can't be effective unless you're disciplined. And this whole thing is, if your army's not disciplined, you're not going to have proper control out of them, and you're not going to get the most out of them to some extent. And it sounds harsh, but his whole point is, if you make things explicitly clear what your expectations are, say you tell your men, you can do X, Y, Z, but you can't do these other things. And if you've made that completely clear and they still go ahead and do those things, you're perfectly within your right as a leader of an organization to discipline them for sure. Like, do you agree with that or?
100%.
Yeah.
And I guess disciplining them back then is probably just executing them on the spot.
Yeah.
But in today's world in the workplace, it's probably just letting someone go.
Yeah.
Like in some metaphorical sense, your army in today's world are your employees. A business owner or a business is nothing with the people that are employed inside it. So if you've set out strict ground rules and people are just purposely disobeying them, there's got to be appropriate action, right? Because like you said, what does that say to everyone else? And that applies to your friendships or your relationships. If you set out and you've explicitly told your friends, this is the sort of lifestyle I want to live, these sort of things I want to do, and they're purposely going against you or purposely, I guess, rubbing you the wrong way, they probably have to go as well.
Well, that just shows the level of disrespect, doesn't it?
That's right.
And that's going to be corrosive to what you're trying to achieve ultimately. Like,
exactly right.
And doesn't that get back to a willingness to face fear as well? Because it's like being able to make those hard decisions elicits a lot of fear in people, but you have to be the strong leader and be able to make those decisions when they need to be made.
That's right. Well, what the book alludes to in what you're talking about, he says, if I actually tolerate that insubordinance, what does that say about me? Right?
Your leadership and your strength comes into question.
That's right. Yeah. If you don't do what you said you're going to do, if people disobey you, what does that say about you? And that's the same thing I'm saying with relationships or business. If you tolerate disrespect, that says more about you than the person disrespecting you.
Yeah. And it leads to a negative attitude from people looking on.
That's right.
What's interesting though is he understands that there'll be insubordination, but what he stipulates is that if you're men, say you're the commander of an army and you have leaders below you that do the interactions with the lower army men or something like that, if those men start acting out, the people he'll actually punish are the leaders below him, because he says that it's actually their responsibility to have their men disciplined and to have their men behaving correctly in some way. So if they're acting out, like you said, it's a reflection on the leaders at that point, and they're the ones that are going to get punished.
Yeah. That's a quite interesting notion. And if you look at business or today's world, you'll have employees that perhaps act up or do the wrong thing. You'll have the owners of that business or the managers saying, your fault, your fault, your fault. Actually, you're responsible for these people. If you're an owner of a business and everything under you's gone wrong, you can't point the finger. You're in charge of that environment. And that's the exact same notion right there.
Yeah. It sort of leads to question, because in the academic literature about leadership, essentially it stipulates that one of the key things is that a leadership inspires through their own actions. And what employees actually do is they model themselves on the leader. So if a leader's strong, they have strong values, they have good habits, and they're always working hard towards this great vision in front, you're much more likely that the employees are going to be working towards that as well. Whereas if you have a leader that makes excuses, they point the finger, they're maybe not that conscientious towards goals, maybe they don't have strong vision, it's likely that your employees are going to reflect that as well. And essentially you're going to breed this cycle of the leader pointing fingers at the employees, maybe firing employees and never taking responsibility for their own actions. And I think over time your organization can't stand up. And I think it'll crumble, but...
I agree. It can't function.
Yeah.
I think competency rubs off on people, but so does complacency.
Yeah.
So it's which one do you want as a leader?
Yeah.
And Sun Tzu stipulates that same notion.
Strong leadership.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess it's an interesting point. I guess another big thing he talks about in the book is kind of being flexible. He talks how important it is to be flexible in warfare or being flexible in your environment. How does that translate into modern day?
Well, can you stipulate a little bit more about that flexibility? Are you talking about, I suppose, have a plan moving forward, but don't rigidly comply to it, even in the face of changing circumstances? Is that sort of what you're eliciting there?
Correct. He talks about the importance of preparation throughout the book, but he also talks about how important it is to be flexible. That's flexible in terms of terrain. That's flexible in terms of your opponent. That's flexible also in terms of your army. Maybe you've got more cavalry, maybe you've got more foot soldiers, right? In today's world, if you're approaching someone and you know they're difficult, you're going to have to be flexible in your approach. The way I sit here and talk to you is probably not the way I'm going to sit here and talk to someone else that I know has got a completely different personality from you. So to be able to be flexible, it probably lends itself to that diplomacy part we talked about earlier, but there's something to be said about that.
Absolutely.
Your approach with everyone's going to be completely different, whether that's your relationships, your employees, your owners.
Yeah. Say an example from wartime. Say you have a plan to march on a city or something like that. And upon approach, you see that a massive river has formed or something that wasn't once there. Well, you're still going to try and cross that river and attack in the same way you thought, or are you going to think of a different game plan? I suppose that is what he's talking about in the wartime aspect. A similar example to business might be, you had a plan of like releasing a product, but then you see that your competitors release like a completely similar product. Well, sure, you could release it as well, but it might be diluted at that point. And maybe you have to come up with something else that exceeds what you currently have, or is in direct opposition to the opponent's product or something like that. It's just thinking fluidly to some extent.
Yeah, you got to be adaptable.
Yeah.
And how much of that do you think is a personality trait as opposed to something you can consciously do?
Well, it's a good question, because it depends whether you have the belief that personality is malleable or it's set. Because obviously, if you look at the personality dimensions, there's something called openness, and some people are higher in that than others. But is that something you can train, do you think? Like, it's a hard question.
It's a fair question. I would say your personality trait is kind of inherited. You are the way you are in some way or another. I'd say you can consciously go against it or consciously be flexible, but it's probably going to be a little bit more difficult if that's not already ingrained in you from the get-go. Like some people are ambitious or they're not. Some people are flexible or they're not. Some people are open or they're not. You can work towards the other way, but I just think it's difficult.
Well, that leads me to think everyone's personality is different. And I think some people lend themselves to certain responsibilities, certain jobs, certain areas. So it's like, you're probably not going to put someone that's super rigid and unable to change in a position where change needs to occur. They're probably more suited to something technical or something less dependent on that change element. So it's like, in the first place, you probably wouldn't put someone like that in a leadership position, to be honest with you. You'd want to put someone that has a high level of openness, a high level of emotional intelligence. I'll say something interesting about emotional intelligence though, because there's the two types of intelligence. Obviously, the regular intelligence, which is like how quick you can process information, how good you are at pattern recognition, etc., which is more technical. But emotional intelligence is the thing that allows you, to have empathy for others, to see things from other people's perspectives, to read the room, etc., which are all very key skills. You can actually train that one, whereas you can't train the other one. So there is hope for people that may have a personality that lends themselves to have low emotional intelligence. They can probably develop it up to a point, to an extent.
Right, so someone's really rigid. Can you train them to have a high emotional intelligence to then step into a management position?
You can, but it's just not natural to them. So maybe they wouldn't even want to do that in the first place. But if you had to, you could probably teach them fundamental skills to be able to do it.
Okay.
But they're never going to be the gun manager of someone who has the personality for it, in my opinion.
Is that because it's not, I guess, in some sense, authentic to them?
I would say.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at a good leader, if you look at them just in everyday life, what they're doing almost looks natural to them. Like we know some leaders in our personal life, and when you observe them from the third point of view, they almost look slick in what they're doing. It's so genuine and so natural in the way they conduct themselves. Where if someone's not particularly, made for that sort of path, it's going to look unnatural. It's almost they're going to have to grind to be a leader, and that's probably not going to rub well on other people. If that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And it definitely is along the lines of personality dependence for sure. I mean, on the point of staying fluid, is that not also respecting sort of natural laws and stuff like that as well? Certain things that I suppose are just facts. Like you have to respect nature because it can come through and wipe out your plans in some extent, like your physical plans. Is there any way to, I suppose, transfer that sort of natural laws to something like business or relationships? Like, do you have any ideas around that? Or
when you're talking about natural laws, are you saying we got strengths and weaknesses? Should you stick to the things that I guess inherently align with you?
To some extent, yeah.
It's kind of a tough pill to swallow because if you go down that line, you're probably telling people if you're not made out for leadership, you'll never be an owner of a business, or you never step up, that corporate ladder. And it's probably true. I would say just because you're competent in the industry you reside in, it probably doesn't mean you should be a manager. I think management's something that should be strictly reserved for people that can lead people.
Do you think?
And I don't know if I'm stepping out of line saying that, but not everybody's made to lead people or talk to people.
Well, do you think leadership and management are interchangeable?
I think if you're a manager, you got to be a leader.
Yeah.
How can you retain people for a long time if you don't lead them, or you don't inspire them in some sense?
So what you're saying there, essentially, you're implying that to be a leader is to have vision, to have direction, and to be able to communicate with people.
Well, if you're working under me and I've got no direction whatsoever, what are you going to be doing every day?
Directionless.
You're just going to be going through the notions. And if I'm not telling you to do something, I'm just not going to do it.
Yeah.
Right. I got to instill the values I want from you in myself.
Yeah.
And only through that will you do what essentially I want you to do.
Yeah.
But it's through that indirect notion. If I sit across the table, as I said previously, and scream at you what I want, how likely are you to do it?
Well, I'll do it out of fear for a while, but I won't do it for the long term, for sure.
100%.
Yeah.
But if I actually live in that way, the way I want you to, you're going to be so much more likely to pick on the habits I want you to do, for example.
Yeah. Well, you're just talking about motivation and inspiration.
I am, we're kind of going off topic, but I think it all kind of applies to each other.
Yeah.
Like Sun Tzu was someone that everyone around him was inspired by him through his philosophy. Not through him trying to expend himself onto everyone around him. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, 100%. He was an impressive person and people wanted to follow him. I mean, that gets back to what we were saying last week about people that have strong character. It's no different than just explaining that they have strong vision and direction.
Right. Yeah.
And when they say something, they do it. Whereas someone with weak character is someone that's every week they're sort of flip-flopping and they have a new idea. Oh, maybe I'll go through with it. They make plans with you and they break it. Whereas someone with strong character, like I said, follows through.
You kind of just sway with the wind if you don't have that strong character. Yeah.
And you don't respect those people at all in your own life. Like someone that you make plans with and they're just constantly breaking it. It's like you're sort of a weak person, to be honest. Like it's not someone you want to actually probably interact with.
Sure. I mean, what's apparent to me, the older I get in life, is the people that reach the pinnacle of everything tend to have a really strong character. And generally they tend to have really strong morals as well.
Yeah.
And I guess there's outliers to everything, but there's something to be said about who it is that you are is more important than any sort of material advantages or disadvantages you may have.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. Like there's definitely a certain set of key characteristics that successful people have. And it's something like, and we talked about it a little bit last week, but it's something like there are certain values that are just facts. And sort of what I was alluding to about the laws of human nature to some extent, the laws of nature, the things that just are. Those people that achieve success are achieving those values. And it's because we all have these value structures that are actually aligned to some extent. We all look up to people that hit those values because they're integral to us. Right. So something like hard work is obviously glorified because we know what hard work looks like and we know what you can achieve through hard work. You can achieve monetary success. You can achieve success for your family, like success for your community. Good things are built upon it. So when someone displays those characteristics, you look up to them to some extent.
Well, not all values are equal, is what you're saying. And there is a value hierarchy, and those people that are constantly displaying those values at the top, of course, they're going to inspire you.
Yeah.
You talked about the people that attain success. I'll ask you a question. What do you mean by success?
We just got to turn these off and on. It's about to turn off.
Okay. Go and chuck a piss in?
Yeah.
On bus.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that success is Success occurs when you set out to achieve something and you do it. So say you're at one place in time, say it's a physical goal, like run a 10K or something like that. A simple example, success would be running the 10K. It would be having a vision, understanding what it takes to achieve it, and then going through the steps to actually achieve it.
So success for you has nothing to do with the monetary aspect.
My understanding is that the monetary aspect comes with the territory of success. Right. It's not that monetary success is success. I think money just comes from being good at something.
You're saying money's a consequence of being driven, essentially, or conducting or doing what you say you're going to do.
I think so.
Right.
What is success to you?
Yeah, it's an interesting notion. I think just because you have a lot of money, I wouldn't say you're successful. Success, in my eyes, is influence around the people around you. And I think it just so happens to be people that are highly successful and have big businesses tend to be really influential. I think that's the result of who they are, not because of any sort of monetary thing. You know, you can have a lot of money and not be successful.
Yeah, I mean, obviously money is only one aspect, and to live a fulfilling, meaningful life, there's many different areas that you have to be successful in. So it's like, yeah, just because you have a lot of money, you could have just inherited that. Are you successful and do you live a good life now?
That's right.
Probably not.
That's right. Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. I mean, do you have some ending thoughts for this episode? Is there any more notions you want to cover or?
Yeah, I would say, look, finishing thoughts is warfare thousands of years ago has gone out there and slaughtering people. Sun Tzu's approach is, how can I win this war without slaughtering people?
Yeah. In
today's world, I would say the biggest takeaway is, how can you convince somebody your way of thinking without screaming at them?
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean you need to be only around people that think like you or do things like you, but how can you influence people, what you perceive, in a positive way without brute force?
Yeah. What I would say is all of this stuff is heavily dependent on leadership. And I think to be a good leader is to understand the severity of your own actions, how you actually influence the people around you for the positive or the negative. It's like not until you can actually get to a point where you understand yourself and you understand, if I do this, it'll probably get this reaction. It's not until you get to that point where you can actually be successful and influence, to be honest with you. And that takes self-reflection and introspection, and that takes understanding friends, family, colleagues, etc.
100% agree. I think that's a good point to stop.
Yeah.